Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Pamela Kyle Crossley, a professor of Chinese history at Dartmouth College and the author of the upcoming book, China's Global Empire, Qing 1936 through 1912, to talk about her research on ethnic identity in Qing China and how notions of Chinese and Chineseness factor into modern China today. Dr. Crossley, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
It's a pleasure, thanks.
Your book, A Translucent Mirror, is a book that really struck me. It's something that I read back when I was in college. Can you just start by telling people in the audience what it is that you're discussing / arguing in this book, and why is this an important area of research? And just to add to that as an extension, for those in my audience who may be unfamiliar, can you elaborate on terms that you use in the book, such as Manchu and Chinese, and what does that mean for people who aren't too familiar?
Right. Well, let's start with the terms. I think one of the book is written in the spirit of not defining things like that. In other words, understanding them as being produced by historical processes, which is what's being examined in the book. And I think before the book and then subsequent to the book, this is something that I've sort of been elaborating, this idea that ethnicity, the way that many people use this word today, is really, this is a projection, this is a retrospective projection by people today, looking at the past and assuming that people are going around feeling ethnic, talking ethnic, thinking ethnic, when in fact the evidence that anything like that was happening is very, very thin. On the other hand, why do we today, right, want to project this onto the past? Why is this such an important part of our lives today? And so what I was actually examining in the book, and this has become more important to me since then, was this process by which in the Qing, conquest as a phenomenon for the Qing, it starts before China, but then continues through China. So conquest and the way that state building intertwines with conquest, and the way that identity ascription, right, becomes part of this process of state building, is, I think, essential to understanding where the Qing state came from, why it had the qualities it had. But I knew at the time I was writing the book that, in fact, this isn't exclusive to the Qing. This is a phenomenon that you can find in all the great overland empires of early modern Eurasia. So you can find it in the Russian Empire, in the Ottoman, to a certain extent in Mughal, and in a very special form in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In all these cases, the form of the emperorship and the ways in which identity ascription happened, they're parallel, and has a peak sort of in the 18th century in the case of China, and then in the 19th century we start into these other processes. But here's what's interesting about what comes out of this. These empires, Qing, Russia, Ottoman, all of them, the criteria of identity that they used were the same basically as the criteria we use today. So they were sort of trying to link together language, ancestry, religion, place of origin, and to use these to ascribe particular identities to certain populations within the empire. In other words, these empires are things in parts, and the parts are being defined on the basis of these criteria. Well, the bit of the story that I'm writing in forthcoming books is this actually, basically through the Russian Empire, becomes the foundation of early modern social science in Europe. And so when you get to Herder, right, when you get, and then after Herder to Weber, and you're looking at the people who are coming up with this supposedly objective criteria of identity. So it is things like language and ancestry and so on. These are actually the criteria that were established in this conquest era and became sort of formulaic attributes of identity. Now, I didn't say ethnicity, I said identity. My main, not main concern, big concern for me is that nowadays people use ethnicity to describe any kind of cultural identity that people have. So everybody's ethnic, more or less. I think this is a useless way of using the word, and that if you go back to Weber, that's not the way that he used the word. He used it in such a way that what you're describing is the condition, the ethnic condition, which is of being marginalized, of being not part of the formal, classical, central, national identity, but basically being in a condition where you live in somebody else's culture and you have your little sort of subculture inside of that. The reason I think it's important to preserve an idea like that is that then you bring power back into the story, relative differentials of power between people who are at the center of a sort of cultural hierarchy and people who are at the edges of it. And once you bring power back into the story, then you're actually doing history again. And I think it's an unfortunate kind of fashion among many historians, but certainly in my field, to dehistoricize this word ethnicity and just sort of use it to say, you know, like you could go up to anybody and say, what's your ethnicity, right? Whereas the historically meaningful idea would be Germans in Germany are not ethnic, right? English in England are not ethnic. Chinese in China are not ethnic. And that's the way that you bring power back into the story. So I wanted to, on the one hand, keep this sense of the historical dynamism, where you have a center and you have peripheries, where you have power differentials, where you have some pretty dramatic differences in the way that the histories of these peoples are narrated. And then on the other hand, to put it in the historical context of conquest. So the Translucent Mirror was basically a case study of the way that this happened in the case, in the instance of the Qing, but it's not a phenomenon exclusive to China in any way at all.
So going a little bit deeper into, you know, these categories in their history, how were these ethnic categories constructed? You talk about, for instance, genealogies being one important part to these constructions. Can you talk a little bit about how that is the case? Like, you know, and if you could just break down into simple detail for those who are trying to wrap their heads around this topic, how do genealogies play into that? And also, who were these ethnic categories important to, and why were they important to them? They must have had some sort of social, political purpose during the Qing.
Yeah, well, to be the most concrete we can be, in the case of Qing, when, if we go back to, when we're going back to the beginning of the 17th century, when we have this kind of the antecedents of the Qing state then, and they're starting to put together this socio-military organization that's going to become the Eight Banners, right? The famous Eight Banners, the imperial army of the Qing period. The way that this was done was that as, again, we're going back to this conquest principle, as Narachi, the founder, is expanding his base, he's incorporating villages. And so the village becomes a company, as it were, within this larger organization of the 8 banners. A person is going to be appointed as the kind of captain of that unit. And that's going to be more or less a hereditary status. So genealogies at that point become an organizing principle, that we're going to take people who are from the same village and put them in the same company, and we're going to choose the captains of that from those who have the same ancestry as the original captain, unless, you know, they commit some crimes and then we take it away from them, but normally that will be our organizing principle. Now, this is happening in an environment in which not everybody has a written genealogy. Actually, they have, because of their folk religion, they do worship their ancestors. They have at least oral accounts of their ancestors, but not everybody's got some kind of document that's got seals all over it to show how authentic it is. So in that case, but you have to present a genealogy. So in that case, you go away and you make it up. You might interview your grandparents and say, oh, you know, put some names in here and so on, and write them all down. It's an interesting part of that sort of transition, this very early process of state building, that written documents are now taking on, right, this special kind of authority. So you had to take things that previously were orally transmitted sort of knowledge within the family, and write them down and submit them, right, to a specially designated officer who's then going to collect them and so on. So over time, you have this huge collection of genealogies. Now, genealogies always, in every culture, are basically, how to say, you have to regard them with some skepticism.
Right. It seems sort of like hearsay a little bit.
Yeah, they're not, these are not sort of objective bits of evidence in any culture at all. Some people can present more evidence of what their genealogy is, some have got less. Some people can orally recite 9 generations and do it in a way that, you know, subsequently we might discover documents showing it's very reliable. Others not. Doesn't matter. Once they've been accepted into the sort of documentary base of the empire, they're all equal, because the point is to just have one. And we know that in the case of the Qing, you know, even in a very prominent case, you could submit one that was just made up, but if it served the proper purposes, then it would be accepted as authentic. So, so what I'm saying is that this is the use of the genealogical principle as an element of state building, and in fact, it's indispensable to the process of state building. You had asked why, you know, why genealogy on the one hand, but what about this ethnic thing on the other hand? I actually think that, you know, the usefulness to any kind of a regime of being able to employ these labels goes back at least to the Middle Ages. Let's say we're putting Middle Ages in quotes because it's a heuristic device here, but let's say before anything we would think of as the modern period. In the sort of medieval times across Eurasia, people are basically getting their identities from their class. So aristocrats are just aristocrats. They don't have a nationality. They don't have an ethnicity. But the people below the aristocrats often have some kind of a cultural label because it's part of the history of their dependency. So at some point they were captured, at some point they submitted, at some point, you know, they entered into the scope of domination of this state. And at that point they were given this label. And the aristocrats don't have them because having a cultural label like this is actually part of the process of dependency. Now, when we get into this early modern era, these grand conquests, the scope of dependency expands. And as that happens, you have more and more people being ascribed these ethnic labels. And eventually, look at the 18th century, they do creep up into the aristocracy, but that's because the aristocrats themselves are losing ground politically in relation to the rulership. And I'm including Europe here and all of Central Asia and China and so on in this, sort of broad generalization. So ethnicity, I think, or let's say cultural labels, that's what I would call them, because that would encompass both people in an ethnic condition and people in a national condition, right? So, the use of this in the process of conquest is, that's more or less the way I would describe it.
And just to let people know who may not realize this, but the Qing dynasty, it was ruled by people who are ethnically non-Han Chinese. So in some ways they were sort of considered invaders from the north. Was there political benefit? Did you find any historical evidence of people finding political benefit in particularly trying to tailor their genealogy in order to get into the Manchu group? Was there sort of political clout to be found in that?
Yeah, this is a very important point. And I think this is something that in the field of Qing studies, right, has become complicated. People have tried to sort of tailor some terms to fit this idea that, okay, here's what we have. We have people who are in a numerical minority who are coming from outside of China. In this case, it's the Manchus. And they're coming in and they're conquering China. And then even though they are small in number and it looks like they should be marginalized, actually they're in control of the whole thing. And so what do you do about that, right? Suppose you go back to this dichotomy I was speaking of before, where you've got people who are in a national position and then you've got people who are in an ethnic position. What about people who are in this outside minority and come in and conquer, take over? I'm not sure it's as complicated as all that. I mean, first of all, this name Manchu that we have, which people will associate with Manchuria, and there are people who think, oh, maybe the Manchus are called Manchus because they come from Manchuria. No, it's the other way around, right? The Manchuria is called Manchuria because this is where the Manchus came from, or according to their imperial ideology, this is where they came from. As I said, ethnicities are not, these cultural identities are not stable. They change very rapidly over time. And when this state was being formed in the 17th century, it was happening in an environment in which there was a tremendous amount of fluidity in the way that people were living their lives in terms of what language they're speaking and whether they're living in the city or the countryside, and whom they're going to marry and what they do for a living and so on. And so the traditional term for the broader part of the population there was Jurchen. And in the process of state building, the state assigned a new name to the majority of their followers in their locality, right? So they were not a minority right there. And decided to call them Manchus. And I think it was it wasn't just that the name of one group got changed to another. It's that the old name didn't really mean anything anymore, and they needed a new name to describe these people. So right there, the cultural label and the building of the state are going together right there. Okay, so they had a war against Ming and they took over Liaodong province, which was this easternmost, it's outside the Great Wall. Then suddenly they're ruling over a majority of Chinese. I mean, a huge majority of Chinese. So the Manchus are now a small group in the minority. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. Beginning in Liaodong, or at least Western Liaodong, and then continuing through China, it's not the Manchus who are doing the conquering, right? So they're actually drawing over to their side huge numbers of former Ming soldiers, Chinese soldiers, who have decided Ming is hopeless, that'll never work out, we've got to have somebody new. I'm getting on the side of these people. And of course, they are rewarded for that in a very dramatic way. So they build a completely new hierarchy. And the Manchus, yes, they are, over time, they become a smaller proportion of the 8 banners. But the Manchus themselves are not in charge of anything. The imperial family is regarded as a distinct entity. It is a class of its own, the Aizingyoro, and they've got, you know, tens of thousands of people, you know, by the end of the 17th century. So they're the ones who are in charge, right? The Manchus are just military slaves of that group. So calling it a Manchu regime, a Manchu empire, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. In other words, I think creating a kind of conceit in which the Manchus are somehow or other running the whole thing. The Manchus are in charge. The Manchus are somehow lording it over, right? This great number of, and therefore are not marginal. I just don't think that works as a description of the Qing regime. So the Manchus come in, they are basically a new group, but they can claim an old history because they see themselves as part of the sequence of civilizations in Northeast Asia. So they feel they've got their own sort of legitimacy behind them. They can come in, this Aizingyoro imperial family can come in, conquer the whole thing. So what is interesting to me, and I wrote an earlier book, right, called Orphan Warriors, was the process by which the Manchus in the 8 banners, living in these garrisons that were distributed all around the country, had a legally prescribed identity until about the middle of the 19th century, after which, because of massive changes in the Qing Empire, they were on their own. They could decide if they wanted to, whether they were going to be Manchus now or whether they would just melt into Chinese society and never worry about that. The ones who at that point decided, I'm still going to be a Manchu, it's on I have to finance it myself, I have to make my decisions about that. That's the point at which, to me, they become ethnic. They know they're living in Chinese society, but they're going to have their ethnic subculture within that society. And they're shaping it around the experience of Manchus in China. They're not shaping it around some, fantasized, shamanic, Altaic, something or other from Northeast Asia. It is ethnic at that point. So that process by which they became ethnic was something I had sort of explored earlier. And I think this is probably the best way to look at it, most concrete way to look at it for sure.
One thing that I really appreciate about your book is that you've pointedly noted that the notions of terms like Manchu and Chinese have served nationalist goals in China. So sort of connecting it to more recent times, or even looking at the early Republican period, legitimizing the Republican Revolution in terms of Manchu and Chinese as formulating an us-them dichotomy in order to stir up resentment toward the Manchu peoples as a group of foreign conquerors. Can you further elaborate on the political dimensions of ethnic classification in the late Qing and early Republican period? And also, in what ways have the notions of Chinese and Chineseness been used to serve nationalist goals in China as of 2022?
Well, that's pretty complicated, but let's see if we can make it pretty simple. In the Qing era, there's no sort of generalized phenomenon of ethnic classification. There's select groups whose cultures are being curated by the state. So it's the Manchus, it's the Chinese, it's the Mongols. It later is added Tibetans and Uyghurs of Xinjiang. So they all have a different orthography, which is a help. So you see that on Qing monuments. You see the emperor basically acting out the various roles that would translate into legitimate ruler in each of these cultural systems. They become very stereotyped. And they all are, intimately tied to the rulership itself. Now that's whatever that is, 5, right? And if we were actually to go across China in, let's say, 1800 and see how many distinct cultural groups we could find, it would be hundreds, right, or thousands. So to the people who are handling this in the Qing state, they're just thinking about how we're going to rule these different groups in their border areas, right, of Southwest China and even parts of the Northeast. And they're not really thinking so much that, well, we're going to have these abstract classifications, and then wherever we find these people, you find them in their homeland, and the problem is how we're going to control that area. So it may be indirect rule, but over time you want to convert it to direct rule because it gives more control. So here's the point. When you get to the end of the Qing, those narratives, which I've called constituent parts of the emperorship or constituencies, of which there are only 5, they have nationalist movements, right? They have movements, they are able, in terms I'm using in my new book, they're able to describe their identities as inevitable. They know that when the empire falls, we will still be here. So the Chinese will still be here. The Manchus will still be here. The Mongols will still be here. But if you are, let's say, Hui Muslim, if you are Miao down in Southwest China, you're not necessarily still going to be here, right, after the empire. Now, let's say Mongols, right, because the Mongols are successful at creating a separate state for themselves. They have resources because they have had this special relationship to the conquest history of the Qing. They have resources. Their language is documented. They've got primers for studying their language. They've got geographical histories. They've got collections of biographies. They've got the resources you need to run a nationalist movement. And so do the Chinese, and so do Tibetans, right? And so do the Uyghurs. But there's other groups who don't have these resources. And what you find is that the nationalist movements are limited to those groups whose narratives have been constituent parts of the emperorship. And the others are going to be ethnic. That is, they're going to live in somebody else's society. Probably China, but who knows? So at that point, you can see this distillation between nationalist and ethnic right there at the fall of the Qing Empire. And that's going to continue through the Republican period in China and through, this theocratic period in Mongolia and so on, right? Each of these places. So I find that, the principle that I use, that I wrote an essay about this fairly recently, is nationalism rewrites the state. So groups who are able to see themselves as national, that is, as inevitable, that is, the current political form can disappear and we will still be here. Groups who can do that, and they have the resources to do that, they have written histories, they have coherence, they have whatever it is you need, they will rewrite the state. In the case of the Qing, the empire goes away and the republic emerges, right? In China, the theocratic government emerges in Mongolia. Nationalism has rewritten the state, but it rewrites it from whatever it was to what it's going to become. So what you find is that an imperialized territory can become a republic. An autocratic society can become democratic. under the forces of nationalism. But a democratic society can become autocratic under the forces of nationalism, because the proposition in nationalism in each case is we can define the nation as an interest group. We can measure the way that those interests are being served against the way that the state is doing it in real time. And if we find the discrepancy, then it's time for a nationalist movement that will rewrite the state. So if you're a national group, you've got the power to at least get the movement going. You may or may not succeed, right, in your nationalist goals. But if you're an ethnic group, I mean a genuine ethnic group, you are resigned to living in somebody else's culture. You may be able to create an enclave. You may be able to have dignity. You may be able to have equality in political, economic terms. But in terms of your identity, if you are ethnic, you are resolved to living in somebody else's culture. Now, that's the way I would see the history through the 20th century. In the 21st century, I do think we are seeing some very, very profound changes. And people are now creating identities that don't any longer conform to those old conquest standards of language and religion and homeland and ancestry. People can form identities in the 21st century, I mean, really coherent identities on completely different criteria. And language is one of the first ones to sort of fade away. So I think we're in a new era now, but the 20th century was very largely controlled by those early modern conquest criteria of identity.
So not to misinterpret what you're saying, is your implication more that the expression of identity has become a little more liberal in China? Or
in China, do you mean now?
Yeah, like 21st century China.
Oh no, it isn't. And you know, there's a kind of ebbing and flowing of essentialism, right? This sort of idea that people cannot be easily assimilated. They've got some kind of an intangible spirit, right, of identity to them, and so that will always be there, no matter what language they're speaking. And so this essentialism in China has taken the form through the 20th century of understanding that certain groups, because of their essential qualities, will always be incompatible with mainstream Chinese culture. So in the 30s, right, you would see waves of this, as there would be, particularly under the KMT, there were these pretty aggressive policies of cultural assimilation in Southwest China, which is where the Qing had also concentrated on assimilation. But when you get into the history of the PRC, it really begins to revolve around this idea of there are cultural groups who will never be compatible with the political agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. So there again, you can see essentialism, waves of intense essentialism, like in the Cultural Revolution, where the assumption was we have to destroy the superstitions of the Tibetans. We have to destroy the nomadism of the Mongols. It's wasting land that we desperately need to feed all of these people. We have to defeat these societies that are jealously guarding their religious traditions, and so they have to simply be destroyed because they have to be destroyed because they cannot be assimilated. Now, liberalism, I mean, I saw liberalism in the 80s and the 90s, in the early part of the 21st century, where there was more of a relaxation of central control. There was more of a willingness to work together with localities, particularly in terms of managing their economic life. And in the 21st century, since 2013, right, we've had a return to this essentialism. Essentialism in terms of understanding Chinese culture, but essentialism in terms of understanding minority cultures, which are now seen as somehow subversive, right? Vulnerable to being manipulated by people from the outside. So there's an ebb and flow, right, to this essentialist thinking about identities. And in the PRC, I think the most intense points were the Cultural Revolution, and now today again.
Just a couple more questions before we go. Maybe I'm wrong in getting this impression, but it seems like if you were, I get the impression that if you were to conduct this research today, there might be a little more political sensitivity around it in
Yeah.
China. Do you get that sense too? Like that's the case, like it would be more difficult to conduct this kind of research that you're doing in China now. Why or why not?
Yes, it's difficult now to do almost any kind of historical research. It's just not about China. This is not even about the CCP. This is about the current regime in China that has established all these new criteria for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, particularly in historical study. There are certain regimes that feel that their survival depends upon being able to propagate their own view, their own narrative, and this is one of them. So yeah, anything that relates to so-called non-Han, right? It's just a word that we made up at some point, and now you're supposed to act like it means. So anything relating to non-Han, anything relating to border areas, right? Anything that relates to Qing history, and particularly to the history of conquest, right? You're not allowed to see the Qing Empire as an empire of conquest. Right. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do the research. You wouldn't be able to discuss the ideas. It's not because Chinese historians don't understand it, don't know about it. It's because of the way that the regime has now sort of exerted these controls over academic discussion.
And just as a brief extension of that, are you, along with the border closure and then, COVID, I know researchers who are in China right now who can't access the archives and they're using COVID as an excuse. I mean, in terms of the short-term future, are you, like the next 5 to 10 years, are you optimistic about the state of research in China, or are you pessimistic? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that is a very interesting question, because every year that passes under the current conditions is a year in which younger historians are not receiving the training that they need, right, in order to be able to go back to serious historical research at some future date. So I always think, yes, it must be that things are going to get better, but the question is how will people be trained, right, to be able to deal with that? Am I pessimistic? I'm not pessimistic, but I think we have to be patient. And in my view, doing history always has to be done from the outside. That's the only real thing. We don't have any past people here to actually tell us about it, and we're not in the past. So even if you are doing the history of your own society, it's still a foreign country to you. You're here. You're not in the past. So to me, the importance of having the greatest number of perspectives you can have on your history, that this is actually essential to doing history. You can't have a single narrative, which is the ambition of the current government in China. We've been through periods in the United States where we thought we had to have one narrative of our history, and there were some resemblances here, say in the 1950s, to the way that China is now. But I think you've got to have the greatest number of perspectives you can possibly have. And so we've all got to keep doing our work, right, so that someday we will be back in communication with our colleagues in China, and we'll all be working on something that we all agree is actually history.
And just to cap off our conversation, one question that I like to ask a lot of scholars who deal, at least in part, in pre-modern period or pre-modern China or any pre-modern period in general. It seems like the current attitude in the general public is that history, which is not recent history, is sort of unimportant, it's frivolous. In your view, what would be the best elevator pitch for why it's important to study pre-modern history?
Well, those questions, strangely enough, are asked by my colleagues. I think everybody who works on a period before 1800 probably feels, when they look around their department, more and more and more of these people are all doing sort of post 1900 history and thinking that somehow that's more relevant than doing something before. So I think the difference is this. There are historians, I have colleagues among them, who think history is the study of the past. But there isn't any past. I mean, where is it? Bring it in here. Let's take it into the lab and, do some things with it. There isn't any. All there is evidence of the past. And on the basis of the evidence, we sort of speculate. There must have been a past. It's speculative in the same way we speculate about the afterlife, except we don't have any evidence of that one. We have evidence that makes us think that there was a past. To me, that's the key. What historians do is they find and evaluate evidence, and being able to get from a piece of paper, right, from that looks old, or an artifact, being able to get from that to an analysis and to a narrative, those are the skills of the historian. And in fact, the more remote you can go into the past, the greater the challenge to those skills, and that makes the training even more valuable. So I think even people who, there are people working on American history who can specialize in a decade, right, or a half a decade, and they've got documents, as high as mountains that they can go through to study that. Even those people should really be trained in what you have to go through to come up with a little bit of historical analysis that relates to, let's say, the 1st century BCE, because the skills of the historian lie in the evaluation of evidence and the creation of information. And in the 21st century, information is like the central issue, right, for all of us. And historians actually live right there, right at the interface of evidence and information. And so those skills are absolutely critical. Historians who think other people need them to tell them about the past, no, what they need you to do is to find and analyze the evidence of the past. So as long as historians are doing that, it's all good. And the further you go back into the past, the greater the challenge, so the better training it is.
Dr. Crossley, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to talk to you.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NakotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.